I've decided to take the time to share experiences that I had, experiences my wife had, and experiences that people in her family had that I have been told about. This is about the house that my in-laws owned when I first met the woman who is now my wife. They moved from this house in 1996 and sold the house in either late 97 or early 98. I use the present tense of is haunted because we know that it continues to be haunted by two different ghosts. One of the ghosts is not friendly and dislikes people, and that ghost tends to remain in the basement and tries to stay well away from people. The other ghost roams the rest of the house and wherever people tend to be, including the basement bedroom. First, we need to go through some context. I met my wife in late 1995 when I went to work for her at a local retail seasonal Halloween store where she was the manager. We started dating after that store had closed for the season and I was working elsewhere, while she had returned to the parent store as an assistant manager. I can't recall when she first told me that her house was haunted. I do recall that I had a hard time believing it, even though I have believed in the existence of ghosts since I was a small child. Her parents' house was already over a century old at the time I met her. It was set back from the street about 50 feet further than the surrounding houses, and had 3 floors, a first and second floor, and a basement. When you came in the front door, the formal dining room and living room were combined, with the dining room furniture on the left and the living room furniture, TV, couch, etc. on the right. There was a half door, the lower half, that separated the living and dining room from the kitchen. The kitchen had a dining table in the back right corner that had a bench seat along the 2 walls, which is why I refer to the other dining room as formal. Immediately before you exited the living room to go into the kitchen, there was a small bedroom to the right. Once you were in the kitchen, there was a small hall about halfway back on the right that gave access to a full bathroom and another bedroom. At the back left of the kitchen, there was a back door which gave access to the alley behind the house, or, if you turned back to the left, to the front yard and front of the house. Just to the right of the back door, there was a door that gave access to the basement stairs. To the right of the basement door, there was a door that gave access to the stairs going to the second floor. Finally, that other dining table was just to the right of the door to the upstairs. This arrangement meant that the back of the basement was actually the front of the house. I just want you to know this, so you aren't confused when I refer to it that way. My wife's bedroom was in the basement, immediately to the right when you got down the stairs. It was a long, narrow rectangle. Her bed, a twin bed, was in the back left corner of her room, and the room was just wide enough to put a dresser in the back right corner and have a narrow path between the bed and dresser. This was just wide enough to put her stereo system between them against the back wall. She had an old TV on the dresser, and the TV was so old it did not have a remote. Instead, it only had knobs for turning it on and for changing the channels and volume. The only other thing you need to know about this room is that she had a ferret cage along the foot of the bed, which meant the only way in or out of the bed was the path between the bed and dresser. Now, onto my experiences. I would occasionally spend the night. At the time, she was mostly insomniac and tended to be awake all night. However, she would lay there in bed next to me. She was against the wall, while I was along the path between the bed and dresser. On some nights, the TV would turn on at low volume and be mostly static. There wasn't cable TV access in her room. This would wake me up just enough to be aware of it, at which point I would think it was her trying to watch TV, and so I would tell her to turn it off and go back to bed. The TV would duly be powered down and I'd go back to sleep. It took a while for me to realize that it wasn't her watching TV, because she couldn't have gotten out of the bed to turn it on without waking me up. She would literally have to crawl over the top of me to get out of bed. Furthermore, there wouldn't have been anywhere to sit or even lay down to watch the TV, even if she had managed this. There were other times where we'd be watching TV in the living room, and either we would hear someone walking around the second floor, or the cupboards in the kitchen would open and close, even though no one else was home. By this point, all of her family, with the exception of her oldest sister and her husband, had moved away. Her sister and brother-in-law's bedroom was on the first floor, in that little room just off the living room. They tended not to be home at night, as they liked to go out. My wife was 20 at this time, and her sister was 18. It would freak me out a little bit, while for my wife, this was completely normal and expected. My wife told me about the unpleasant spirit that occupied the basement, and told me how you could feel that you were being watched when you were in the laundry area. This area was on the left side of the basement, as you looked towards the front of the house. The back third of the basement really wasn't used by anyone, and my wife told me not to go back there. This area of the basement was always dark, in spite of having large windows, which were there to allow occupants to escape in case of fire. Being curious and tending towards being uncooperative when I'm told not to do something, I proceeded to go back there. You could definitely feel you were being watched, and that something did not want you there. The longer you spent in that area, the more intense the feeling of hatred grew. It got to the point where I decided enough was enough, because it felt like something would have literally murdered me if it could have. My experiences, overall, are fairly limited because we didn't tend to spend much time at her house while we lived in that area. On some nights, when my wife and I were out together, the pleasant ghost would turn her radio on at full volume to country music. The next day, her sister and brother-in-law would complain to her about playing her radio so loud. Naturally, my wife would counter that she didn't do that since she wasn't home, and that she doesn't even like country music. My wife prefers things like typo negative. Her sister and brother-in-law couldn't do anything about this because my wife's room was always locked, and only my wife had the key. Over the years, her mother had had cassette tapes disappear. She would always accuse the kids of taking them, and they would counter that she should leave a note asking for them back, and that the ghost would return it. Something like this happened to my wife once too. The ghost had taken the key to her ferret's cage, which made it very difficult to give it fresh food and water. After a couple of days, my wife left a note in her room asking whoever had taken it to return it, then went to school. When she came home after school that day, the key was there on the note, inside her locked room. Eventually, my wife moved her room from the basement to the master bedroom on the second floor. This room had a bathroom attached to it. Not long before she was to move out, she turned the shower on, had gotten in and wet her hair, then remembered that she left something in the bedroom. As she crossed the threshold to go into the bedroom, she was startled to see a ghost standing there and holding a picture of her and me. She gasped because of the shock, and the ghost turned its head to look at her, then faded away and dropped the picture, cracking the glass. She said the facial features were not defined at all, that it was basically human-shaped, with a discernible head, but no eyes, ears, nose, or mouth, and there were no legs below the knees. She's told me that there were always strange noises over the years, intermittent cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Their dogs and cats would sometimes react to things that were not visible, and hamsters tended to have very short lives, days or weeks, and so they eventually stopped getting hamsters. Once everyone moved out, the activity in the house really ramped up. Two of her aunts took on the responsibility of making sure the house was clean and in good order for showings. They would take turns going over there after work, which tended to be after dark, and it was always just one or the other of them that went. They'd go through the entire house, basement to second floor, and make sure things were clean, orderly, and would turn off the lights as they'd go. As they were leaving, they would notice that the lights in the basement or second floor, especially the master bedroom, which was at the front of the house, were turned back on. They didn't think much of this at first, but over time, they both realized that something was amiss. Eventually, one of them would refuse to go over there at all, for any reason, and at any time of the day. I'm not sure exactly what happened with her. While her other aunt eventually simply refused to go there after dark, or if she had to be there after dark, she would not go there alone, and would make her boyfriend go with her. I know that in one instance, the basement light was on, and she was going to go downstairs to turn it off. As she approached the basement door, she saw disembodied legs standing behind the basement door. There was a 2-inch gap between the bottom of the door and the floor. After this, she refused to ever go in the basement, regardless of the time of day. The weekend after the offer on the house was accepted, her parents went there and some family and friends came over for a night of drinking and reminiscing. My father-in-law loved beer and could drink more beer than any 3 other people I know combined. So there were a lot of empty cans that ended up in the trash the next morning. The trash didn't get emptied for a few days, and it was after her parents had gone back to where they were now living. Her one aunt came over to make sure everything was cleaned up and to take the trash out, and she found all the empty cans stacked in a pyramid in the kitchen sink. Nobody else could have been in the house at that time, because she was the only one with a key other than my wife's parents, and nobody had broken into the house. As the day of closing approached, my mother-in-law came back to the house and thoroughly cleaned it, and my wife's brother-in-law was back staying there to do some other work on the house that needed to be done. He was still working in the area for his day job anyway, and this made it convenient for him to do the work on the house, even though my father-in-law was perfectly capable himself. One day, my mother-in-law was cleaning in the kitchen and listening to a cassette tape on her dual cassette deck stereo. At one point, she paused it to go to the bathroom. When she returned and unpaused it, an entirely different cassette was playing, a Christmas tape by Trans-Siberian Orchestra. I don't know what she had been listening to prior. My wife told her to leave a note asking for the tape back, but her mother didn't believe that would work and never left a note, and never got the tape back either. On another day, my mother-in-law had to go to the basement for something. If I recall correctly, she was doing laundry. While she was in the basement, she heard the front door open and close, footsteps crossed the living room, the half door of the kitchen opened and closed, then footsteps across the kitchen, then the door to the upstairs opened and closed, and finally, footsteps going up the stairs. She figured that my wife's brother-in-law had just come home from work. When she got back to the first floor, she called his name and got no response. Eventually, she had to go back to the basement. When she did, she heard all of that in reverse. Footsteps down the stairs, door to the upstairs opened and closed, footsteps across the kitchen, half door opened and closed, footsteps across the living room, and finally, the front door opening and closing. When my wife's brother-in-law did eventually get home, my mother-in-law asked why he had come home earlier and left, and why he hadn't said anything to her. He denied ever having done that, and stated that this was the first time he'd been to the house since leaving for work that morning. There were never any attempts to cleanse the house. My father-in-law was a stone-cold skeptic who would never have allowed that. They did dive into the history of the property some, and it was, at one point, a fishmonger's house, and he sold fish from the property apparently. I asked my wife just a bit ago, and she can't remember any other details that might have been uncovered. The people who owned the house before my in-laws had crosses everywhere, according to what my mother-in-law had said. She always thought they were just religious, and my mother-in-law is Catholic, so it made sense. It wasn't until after her experiences in the house while she was cleaning it up, before the closing, that she realized it was probably to do with a haunting and not religion. After the sale, we know from talking to the nosy neighbor that the people who bought the house owned it for just about a year. The house changed owners 3 times in 3 years, with the last owners actually completely abandoning it. It sat derelict for a number of years and was stripped of its copper by vandals. They got a good haul because my father-in-law had installed copper piping throughout the house. The house was eventually seized by the city and sold at auction. It has since been rehabbed and is currently occupied. I'd like to ask the current owners about their experiences, but how do you do that? In 2001, I was about 17. My family moved to the coast because my father had just gotten a job in the area. Because it was a bit of an urgent move, and the amount of rental properties that were available immediately were very few, we had to move into a 3-bedroom house that needed some work. It was meant to be a temporary home until we found something more suitable. We just needed to go to school and work in the meantime. The previous tenants weren't the tidiest of people, so we spent days cleaning while already living in the house. I remember my mother commenting that the house just didn't want to be clean. We painted the walls, but stains would reappear, regardless of how many coats we applied. We eventually had to carry on with our lives. It was only meant to be a temporary situation after all. Being a teenager and a middle child, I spent quite some time by myself in my room. I would listen to music at night while lying on my bed, relaxing before I get tired to fall asleep. At one point, something strange started happening. I would be lying on my bed with my eyes closed and feel the bed sink next to my feet, as if someone was sitting down. I assumed it was my old cat jumping onto my bed, but when I looked to see where it was so I could pet him, he wasn't there. I shrugged it off as nothing at the time. I thought that maybe I was drifting off into sleep, but it happened again and again, and I realized it was never my cat. In fact, I realized that my cat didn't ever come into my room. None of our cats did. I started getting slightly concerned after a while. I mentioned it to my mother, thinking to myself that it sounded like nothing, a mere trick of the mind. I still felt uneasy though. It was like there was something wrong, something I couldn't prove or even see, a nagging sense that I wasn't alone in my room. I stopped sleeping with my curtains drawn. They were always open. I needed the natural light coming from outside to feel safe enough to sleep. My concerns were confirmed one night that I still remember clearly to this day, almost 20 years later. I woke up, suddenly terrified. I had an intense fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before, or even since. I couldn't move. There was a tree outside my room, casting shadows on my cupboard, which was right in front of my bed. I knew there was something bad right there in front of me, among those shadows. I could feel it, like an overwhelming presence filling the space in front of me, an evil, threatening presence. I saw that one of the shadows on my cupboard was moving. The shadow was darker and moved with intention. As soon as I spotted it, I knew that that was the source of my fear. I did the only thing I could do to protect myself. I prayed. After what felt like an eternity trapped, I was able to move. Still terrified, too terrified to go past my cupboard to the door right next to it, I hid under my blanket. 17 years old and hiding under a blanket like the bogeyman was under my bed. I fell asleep in the early hours of the morning as daylight started coming through my windows. I know what sleep paralysis is, and I'm convinced this wasn't it. The fear I felt that night as I hid under my bed, feeling like I'm not alone in my room, is something I'll never forget. A month or two after the incident, my parents found a better place. I was scared of my room until we moved. I always slept with my head under the covers and made sure enough light was coming into the room. After we moved, it was like my family finally felt safe enough to speak about the darkness we all know was in that house. My brother told us about a dark figure he saw moving through the corridor area to the kitchen. My father said he saw a dark shape in the corridor near my room, but it was what my mother told me after we moved that shook me the most. She told me that when a family friend and his wife visited us and stayed in my room, he told my mother the following day that there was something evil in there. He was known for sensing the supernatural and seemed quite spooked to my mother as he was telling her this. I could see when she was telling me about this that she was spooked as well. When I asked her what he said exactly, as I was recollecting my memories to tell this story, she said that he had just said he didn't want to elaborate, because if he did, we would never go into that room again. Well, damn, that's not much better, I thought. The family friend has since passed away, without ever elaborating on what exactly he sensed in that house. My mother also told me that she heard that the couple that moved in after us had a priest come to cleanse the house. I'm still superstitious of every house I move into, now with my own family, making sure to burn sage every so often. I don't ever want to share a house with evil again. I have always believed in the paranormal ever since I was little. These experiences while living with my aunt solidified my beliefs, and thankfully, I wasn't alone. I moved into my aunt's house in August of 2020 to experience a little more independence. She has a furnished basement that was basically an apartment with no kitchen, but it worked. My best friend and I decided to move in together after years of wanting to do so. Living with her was the best, and I can't wait to do it again. I can't remember when the weird stuff started happening, but this is not the first time I've lived with my aunt. I was there on and off for years, and lived there with my father my freshman year of high school until he could find his own place. The basement was for my grandparents to stay in when they came to her house for the summer. After my grandmother died, my grandfather lived there full-time until he had to move upstairs for medical reasons. I was the first one to move into the basement last year. My best friend has a full-time job, so she came a few days later after finishing her packing. The first night I spent alone, and it was definitely weird. Ever since my grandmother had passed away, the basement had seemed cold and dark and had a weird energy to it. The first night alone was weird, and I didn't sleep at all. I explained it away as being a new place, and that usually happens to me in a new environment. Like I said earlier, I don't know when these things started happening. All I can remember is them just happening gradually. I would see things out of the corner of my eye, but I would explain it away as my eyes playing tricks on me. I would feel stuff around me also, but I didn't pay much attention to it either. At this point, I had not told my best friend because I thought I was imagining everything. I think it started getting crazier when my best friend and I started practicing witchcraft and driving deeper into our spiritual journey. I know paranormal experiences can be heightened at this time, so this is my only explanation for what follows. I have to describe the layout for this next part. My room was down a long hallway from the living room and my best friend's room. It was at the exact end of this hallway, and the bathroom was sooner than the hall, pretty close to the living room. And next to my door were the stairs to the upstairs. When someone is sitting on the love seat in the living room, they can see down the hall with the corner of their eye. I frequently sat on the love seat, and I started seeing this shadow figure standing at the end of the hallway. I thought I was seeing things again, but that's when I started to get kind of freaked out. It was the figure of a man standing at the end of the hall and would walk into my room. Like I said, I wasn't telling my best friend this information, but little did I know, She was having experiences of her own. We finally talked about these happenings after a terrifying mutual encounter. We were sitting on her bed, watching a music video and discussing it. In the corner of her room, a small ball of light appeared and dropped down to the ground. I assumed it was my eyes again, but I looked at my best friend, and she had a look of horror across her face. We both then knew we were experiencing the same stuff. She told me she was also seeing a man at the end of the hallway, walking into my room. This shook me to my core. Another experience we mutually share happened in my room. My room was really long and large. To paint a picture for you all, we were at my dresser, and my bed is at the other end of my room. I was showing her a new vinyl I had purchased when a woman's voice started speaking in the direction of where my bed was. There was no one on my bed. My TV wasn't on, neither was my laptop. We looked at each other and bolted out of the room. We had insane chills and goosebumps. Truly one of the scariest moments of my life. The last experience I can remember before we moved out was my best friend's experience that she had with my other friend. I was out of town, so no one but my friends were in our basement apartment. My best friend got out of the shower and opened the bathroom door and saw someone walk into my room. She asked our friend if she had gone into my room, but she said she had been sitting in my best friend's room the whole time. They were confused, so they investigated. They walked into my room only to discover my bedroom door was closed, so no one would have gone in there without opening and closing the door, which my best friend would have seen. They opened my door, but no one was in my room. My best friend heard people walking outside of her room constantly. She left her window open frequently, but stopped because she would hear footsteps directly outside of her window, crunching on leaves and everything. We heard whistling a lot outside, and when I house sit, I can still sometimes hear whistling outside in the wooded areas. It's not a very remote location. There are just lots of woods around us. There's a trail behind the house, but there's another set of houses right behind the trail, so not far at all. I wouldn't say the house is remote, and I don't think it was a demon, to be honest with you. I do think it was a very negative entity, as there were lots of issues in the house with the family, causing tons of negative energy that it could feed off of. No throwing objects or many voices, just the one in my bedroom. I only lived there about 5 months. Who knows what could have happened if I'd stayed longer. There's been a weird energy in the house for a long time, not just when we moved in. I think honestly it was a negative energy trying to pretend that it was something that it's not. I never felt threatened, but it felt negative, if that makes any sense. My friend and I cleansed our space with moon water and incense multiple times, so honestly, I don't think it could have gotten much worse, because we have our own means of protection from entities. I try not to jump on demons immediately, because I feel it has to be a lot worse, and we have to feel a lot worse if there was one around. I barely go down to the basement anymore after I moved out. My husband and I built our first home and closed beginning of this year. Before, our neighborhood was all just woods. Since we moved in, a bunch of weird things have been happening that neither of us have ever dealt with before. He has never even believed in paranormal things until this. To start, our first experience was one morning. He was in the master bedroom shower, just off of our bedroom, around 5 AM getting ready for work. I was laying in bed on my phone. All of a sudden, clear as day, I hear a low voice say, "Hey." It was very close and loud, and in the room. I get out of bed and go to the bathroom, asking why he shouted. He had turned the water off and was asking why I shouted. Freaked, he gets out of the shower and checks every room in the house. He gets back in the shower and I lay in bed. I call for our cat to come and lay with me because I'm scared, and our cracked bedroom door shoots open. I thought it was our cat at first, but our cat comes out from under the bed by my hand and stares at the empty doorway. Our daughter was sound asleep in her bed. Some other crazy things that have happened, usually a week or two apart. My husband's work ID went missing for days. He always keeps it in the same spot. We went crazy looking everywhere for it. One night, when our daughter was asleep around midnight, we went to the garage to look through the trash bin to see if we'd accidentally thrown it out. Our laundry room is right off the garage. So after we gave up, we went back inside. His work ID was suddenly sitting in the center of the dryer, right on top. It hadn't been there before we went to the garage. I had been doing laundry and 1000% would have seen it. Plus, my husband had already checked that room twice. Other instances, my husband and I being up late, around 1 AM in the living room talking, and our pantry door closed by itself right in front of us. Another night, we were watching a movie in the living room and our TV randomly turned off. A light randomly turned off. It's never done this before and hasn't since that night. Then our 4-year-old daughter started talking about a ghost man who lives in our house. All she would tell me about his appearance is that he's older, darker, and very tall. She said she doesn't know his name. One night, she told me as I put her to bed that he stands by her dollhouse at night while she sleeps. She has woken up many times around 3 AM, screaming. I comfort her and she goes back to bed. She said she wakes up because he was playing with her toys. She also told me one night that he had just walked into the kitchen so she could fall asleep. Freaked out, after I put her to bed, I go out to the kitchen to find our dog growling at a vacant spot in the kitchen. About a week ago, our daughter told us the ghost man was going to leave our house and find another, that all he was doing was waiting on a goodbye. So we all said goodbye to this ghost, and I thought it was over. Now, tonight, she told me as I tucked her in that he had come back. After she went to bed, I went to our bedroom to relax. Our bedroom is right off of the kitchen. About 2 hours later, I get up to check on her, and she's sound asleep. I passed through the kitchen, and 2 objects had moved since I had last been in the kitchen. My husband is on night shift currently. Our dog was in his kennel. Our cat asleep under our bed. Our daughter hasn't stirred all night. A tray in the center of our huge kitchen island, full of things, had been pushed all the way to the edge of the island. Our daughter can't reach this tray, and also, I would have heard her get out of bed. I moved the tray back, and a box of rice I had set out for dinner was moved several inches and turned backwards. I am now freaking out, not sure what to do. We don't go to church, and I'm not sure where to even start on finding a priest. Our family has always been sensitive to the paranormal. When my mum was young, she was tormented by a force that would slam doors, turn off lights, and even slapped her cheek. For my case, I've had instances of seeing shadow figures, being grabbed and pushed through doorways, but my youngest sister had the worst instance. When she was 5, she got locked in her bedroom, which is weird because the doors have no way of locking, either with a key or those pressure turn handles. She screamed for us to help, and we couldn't open the door. Finally, my dad broke the door open to find her crying in a fetal position under the bed. When we asked what happened, she refused to tell us. She refuses to sleep in pitch black and is very skittish around dark places in general. This was 7 years ago, and we still have strange occurrences happening. It doesn't matter whether we're in our house or away in a hotel. We always have unexplained experiences that are terrifying. My family is devoutly Christian. We go to church every Sunday and are very involved in personal spiritual growth. We've done everything to try and stop these paranormal activities happening. We've had pastors pray over the house, burned sage, prayed as a family, and even had a Catholic priest perform an exorcism on the house. Nothing works. This isn't just my family's problem though. All the way back to my great-grandmother, there have been strong supernatural occurrences. Even 3 generations back, they couldn't get rid of whatever demon haunts our bloodline. The final straw happened last week. My youngest sister stayed home while the rest of the family went to an activity. She was staying in her room on the 2nd story. Suddenly, she heard heavy footsteps above her in the attic. She got scared, but didn't panic as this happened semi-frequently. The footsteps stopped, and then she heard a man's voice yell her name. She stayed in her room and just ignored it. The voice yelled again, but was outside her door. She just assumed it was my dad and ripped the door open to see what was up. She didn't see anything, but felt a hand grab her shoulder. Because we've been dealing with this, we usually handle these extreme cases with a few biblical phrases. She held out her crucifix and yelled, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this house." That must have angered it, because she got 3 long fingernail-type scratches on her back. She freaked out and ran out of the house. My parents came home later and said they felt cold and hateful when they went in her room. We think there might have been a family curse put on us long ago. Right, so this happened many years ago, and I still think of it often. It happened in 1987. My husband and I were living in a small town up north. There were several small towns there, and my parents lived about 20 minutes away. We were very young and had 2 kids at the time. Late one night, probably about 1 a.m, I hear the phone ring. This was way before cell phones, and our phone hung on the wall of the kitchen. I was still scared of the dark after watching a scary movie sometime earlier in the week. Hey, I was still a kid really. I made my husband move the bed to the corner of the bedroom so I could sleep next to the wall. It was one of those old creaky metal beds with the exposed coil springs. It bounced up and down whenever you moved slightly on it. Well, I tried to ignore the phone, but it kept ringing. I tapped my husband and asked him to get it. It never bothered him not to answer, so all I got was a grunt and a no way. So I crawled over the top of him and went to the kitchen, picked up the phone and said hello. No answer. Hello? No answer. The line was open, and it took a few minutes for it to click silent. If you don't know, in those days it was 2 sounds, a dial tone, or the line would just be open. No sound, which usually meant that someone was on the other end of the line. If no one would have called, it would have just been a dial tone. So once the dial tone came back, I just hung up and went back to the room, crawled over my husband and went to bed. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. The same thing as last time. Crawled over him, picked up the phone. Open line for a few minutes. Then dead. Back to bed. This happened 2 more times in about 30 minutes. At about 2:30, the phone rang again. My husband said I should leave it, but I just had a feeling I needed to answer. And even so, just letting it ring off the wall wasn't working. Back when you could literally just let a phone ring till the caller got tired, it never disconnected. I got up, crawled over my husband, and went to the phone. From the moment I picked up the phone, I knew my dad had died. I can't explain it. The caller said, "This is Pastor Donovan." I said, "My dad is dead, isn't he?" Later, he would tell me that this really creeped him out. I heard a weird sound coming from the other end of the phone, but he said, yes, he is. I don't remember much about the next few minutes, but my husband said he found me screaming in the kitchen. I think my dad just wanted to prepare me for what was about to happen. Fast forward to later the next evening. My brother, husband, and I were sitting and talking on the porch. My brother got a call from his longtime friend. You need to understand, this guy has been my brother's friend for about 20 years, or as long as I can remember. Every morning he would pick up my brother for school. Every day. He was a large, heavy-set guy with a big heart of gold. I'll call him L for short. My brother had a weird look on his face and said he wanted to tell me something weird that happened the night before. He said he talked to L on the phone and asked him why he was burning garbage in a pit at about 1 a.m. The pit was out at a dump, and L and my brother worked on the garbage truck together. L lived near the dump and tended to do the burning of the garbage. This was a huge pit, so they only burned it once every 2 weeks, and it had been just burned some days ago. My brother had driven out to look for L so they could run around together and just decided to stop by the pit as he could see the huge flames shooting out of the pit. He said he walked around the garbage burn for a few minutes, smoking cigarettes before he decided to get into the truck and leave. This was the weird part. L said that no garbage had been burned the night before. My brother said he saw it, smelt it, and felt the heat from it. L had been nowhere in sight and said no fires. My brother stopped by later, and sure enough, the garbage hadn't been burned in over a week. All at once, we felt Dad was there. Not outside, but in the house with Mum, who had just fallen asleep on the roll-out sofa bed. His presence was kind of painful, like we could feel his pain. It was very hard. The house was the house I grew up in. It was a very old house, which had been built maybe before the turn of the century. It had always been spooky. You could hear voices whispering constantly, but at a very low level, so you really had to strain to hear it, except at night when it was quiet. I still run a fan at night to this day because I'm scared I'll hear voices. Anyhow, we knew Dad was there and in a lot of pain. We could feel his worry, like a heavy weight on our chests. We all looked at each other and spoke aloud. "It's okay, Dad. You can go. We'll take care of Mum." And just like that, he was gone. Weird thing about that house, a few years ago, they totally demolished the house to build another. Our house was a 1.5-story Victorian with a curved porch on the front, stained glass window seat windows and everything. My mum called me after they had built the new house. She had a weird tone in her voice. She said, "You have to look at the new house." I was now living in Tennessee at the time, and there were still no cell phones that could send the photo, so I had to wait for the mail to arrive a few days later. The house they built was the exact same duplicate of the house I grew up in, only they attached a garage. It was weird. My mum also said that the lady that had it built never lived in it a day. She died the week before moving in. I wonder still to this day if the new owners can hear the voices. Maybe the lady is there too, but I think my dad moved on. My late husband and I met in 1990 at the laboratory we both worked for. Neither of us believed in the paranormal, and in fact, we were both atheists. I still am. However, I now believe that our consciousness continues after bodily death. Here's what changed my mind. In 1995, my late husband and I moved into our home in Seattle. The house was built in 1926 and had not been renovated at all, other than the appliances. A few years after we moved in, I decided we should put an exercise room in the huge basement, as our home was too small to put equipment anywhere else. Around that time, I started to notice that things would go missing, and then we would find those things in very weird places. For example, My husband was cooking and I was in the tub. He came in and asked if I had taken the measuring cup. I had gotten into the bath before he started cooking and had not budged. He said he had it right next to him, had turned away to do something, and when he turned back, it was gone. I got out of the tub, put my robe on, and went into the living room next to the kitchen. My eye caught the sight of the fireplace mantle's glass cabinet door, which was ajar. The measuring cup was on the top shelf of the cabinet. I thought my husband was playing some prank on me, but he swore he did not do it. Keys and small items also started to go missing, then turn up right where I left them, and sometimes in places that made no sense. And then there was the toilet paper. We had several cats, one of whom liked to pee on the bath mat, so we religiously kept the door shut. It was a habit, and neither of us ever left it open. It was muscle memory for both of us. But starting around the time we began renovating, every few weeks, sometimes months, I would open the door to the bathroom to find that the toilet paper had been unrolled in a chevron pattern all the way across the floor. Even if it somehow unrolled on its own, there was no way it would be in a pattern all across the bathroom. It was then that we began to suspect someone was living with us. I made a reservation at La Posada in Santa Fe so we could go there for a long weekend. It was purportedly haunted, and I wanted to see if anything similar would happen somewhere else. Now this part still blows me away. One day, I came home early from work and flipped on the TV. An episode of Unsolved Mysteries was on, and the hotel I was going to was being featured. The show was at least 10 years old, and it was on a channel I rarely watched. It was about the ghost of La Posada. I was shocked at the coincidence. I was going there that weekend. Right then, my friend calls me and says he just turned on his TV, and it was Unsolved Mysteries and was showing my hotel room. He had also come home early and did not watch this channel. We were both dumbfounded at the coincidence. When we went on the trip, it was all quiet the first night, and I was fine with it, though maybe a little disappointed. We were staying in Julia's room in the main house. The property is quite spread out, and most of the guest rooms are individual casitas built all over the property. My mum and stepdad had met us there, but they were staying in one of the casitas about 10 minutes away. The main building where we were staying had a restaurant, bar, and a game room on the first level. Guest rooms were on the second and third levels. The hotel had been a grand home built in the mid-1800s by a wealthy merchant named Joseph Stab. Sadly, his wife, Julia, was mentally ill and really went downhill after the death of one of her children. So she was kept in her room, as it was common to do back then, so the children wouldn't be stigmatized and have their chances at a good marriage jeopardized. Her spirit is apparently quite active. On our second night, we were all playing board games and smoking cigars in the game room after dinner. This was directly below Julia's room. A waitress walked by my dad and spilled a drink on him, so my husband said he would go and get one of his own shirts for him to change into, since my stepdad's casita was a good distance away. My husband left, but then came back less than a minute later. He was very excited and told us that we had to come to the room. I grabbed a staff member to come with us, just in case. When we walked in, I knew why he was so excited. The room just reeked of rose perfume. I mean, it was so strong, I had to step out to catch my breath. I asked the staff member if anyone had gone into our room. She said no, they were not allowed to do that unless it was housekeeping, but this was 9 o'clock at night. She then told us that Julia gets upset when people smoke cigars, and this happens when she smells the smoke. We had been taping in the room just in case there was any activity, but we saw nothing. Nobody else had entered the room since we had gone downstairs for dinner. When my husband and I returned from our trip to La Posada, activity in our home ramped up dramatically. Most notably, the unraveled toilet paper prank happened more often. Now I know you may be thinking that my husband was doing this, and I considered that, but it would have been very difficult to pull off, and he was out of town a lot, and the activity happened even then. I should note that we had one bathroom on the first floor. Our bedroom was on the second floor, next to my office. One night, we went out to dinner with some friends on a Sunday evening. We got home about 10 p.m. We were both pretty tired, so decided to go straight to bed as it was a school night. I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth and get ready for bed. Nothing was amiss. He got ready for bed too, so we turned off the lights downstairs and went up the stairs. He was right behind me. I ran to the bed and jumped in over the footboard. At the exact moment I landed, the TV turned on. It was on some obscure channel that we had not been watching. We had watched SNL the night before. Not only was it on a different channel, but it was playing an old scary movie I remembered watching as a kid called Don't Look Now. I couldn't believe it was playing. I hadn't seen it in many years, but my husband didn't care about the movie. He wanted to know how I turned the TV on. I said I must have landed on the remote and started looking around myself for it. Then he told me not to bother. He pointed to his nightstand, and there it was, a good 15 feet away from him and about 6 feet from me. I knew he didn't turn it on because our TV was a load of rubbish, and the on-off button, if it was on the box, was well hidden enough that I never laid eyes on it. There was a plastic flap or cover at the base of it, and I found out later that you had to reach under it to get to the on-off button. Weird, I know, but that's how it was built. I just used the remote and never really thought about it. I asked my husband how he turned it on without the remote. I honestly wanted to know, but he insisted he didn't do it. And because he didn't have the remote and was nowhere near the TV, I believed him. He was visibly shaken. It still had not sunk in for me. He didn't turn it on, and I didn't turn it on. It was on a different channel. I could only surmise it must be some electrical malfunction, and I blew it off. He did not. I grabbed the remote and studied it for a few minutes, trying to find a stuck button or some logical explanation, but it looked fine, and I used it to turn off the TV. My husband had terrible PTSD from his days in the army, and he said that someone must be in the house. He decided to do a full sweep and started to head downstairs. Not being a total moron, I told him I would come with him. On our way out of the bedroom, I tossed the remote onto the bed. When we walked into the kitchen, we were shocked. All the lights were on, and all the cabinets were open. He was starting to really freak out, and so was I. I now agreed that someone must be in the house, but remembering the toilet paper incidents, my mind started to think it may be something else. We left the kitchen and went into the living room. The light was on in there too, and the chandelier was swinging wildly. I had never seen anything like it. I went over to it and reached up to stop it from moving. As I reached up, I felt a buzzing sensation in my body, kind of like static electricity. That could have been my nerves, but to this day, remains the strangest sensation I have ever had. We decided to continue through the house, and he said he was going to check our basement. We walked down the hall to the basement door, and I told him to hang on because we had walked past the closed bathroom door, and I wanted to see if someone was in there. I cracked open the door, turned on the light, and saw that the toilet paper was once again unrolled in a chevron pattern across the floor. I quickly shut the door. My husband opened the basement door and started to go down the stairs when he let out a yelp, then quickly did an about face and came right back up again. He was pale and shaking and said something cold had just gone through his body. He was really upset, and I had never seen him so frightened. We only had one more room to go, so I told him I'd go in by myself. It was our guest bedroom, and it was just a few feet down from the basement door. I reached over to turn the knob, and all of the door hardware fell out. I was left holding a doorknob, staring at the floor where everything else had fallen. I don't know why, but that was probably the most jolting part of it so far for me. How could all the hardware be loosened just enough to fall when the knob is turned? Someone had to be able to manipulate it just enough to stay on, but also enough that it would fall when the knob was twisted. When the door opened, nothing in the room itself looked off, so we decided to go back to our bedroom to try to calm down and get some sleep. He was behind me as we went back upstairs, and when we walked back into the bedroom, the TV was on again. I know I turned it off, and I know I had not been in the room since we left it. He had been in my line of vision the entire time. Whatever had done all the stuff downstairs had been in our room again. I went to the bed to get the remote, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I scoured that room, looked in drawers, under the bed, pulled the covers off, but found nothing. My husband thought I might have taken it downstairs, so we reluctantly decided to go back down to look for it. I guess we could have just unplugged the TV, but I wanted to know where that remote was. He walked out of the room, and as I was following him, I caught sight of something shiny in the cat litter box. It was a covered box, but the light was hitting something metallic. So I went over and took the cover off. It was the remote control. Yeah, my TV remote was buried in the used litter box. After everything else that had happened that night, this put me over the top. Someone was clearly having fun scaring us, and they were there right now, and I couldn't see them. It was less of a fear of ghosts than it was a fear that came about from knowing that I was visible to someone who was not visible. That was it for the night though, and we went to bed without further incident. Not that I slept a whole lot. There were other miscellaneous incidents as well. Another time, I remember going to my office, also upstairs, and getting this feeling like someone was with me in the room. My husband was on yet another business trip, so I was sure that there were no other humans in the house. The house was very quiet, and I just had this strange feeling. On a lark, I said, "If you're able to hear and understand me, please do the toilet paper thing. I'll give you a few minutes before I go downstairs to check. That'll let me know you're real, or if my husband is pranking me." After 5 minutes or so, I went down to check, and you probably know what happened. I opened the door, and the toilet paper was laid out in a chevron pattern across the floor, again. So now, I was alone with an invisible someone, and I knew that whoever this was could understand me and communicate with me. I still have no idea if he or she was there all the time, or just popped in for mayhem once in a while. It's not like something happened every day, or even every week, but enough happened at that house to change my entire worldview. I did have a housekeeper that came every week, and one time I was outside gardening when she came over. My husband was out of town. About an hour went by, and she ran outside looking panicked. She asked if I had been inside, and I told her I hadn't. When I asked why she wanted to know, she said that she and her sister had been upstairs cleaning the bedroom when they heard the utensil drawer in the kitchen open and slam shut over and over. She thought that someone had broken in because I'm a very chill person, and she didn't think that it was me. I then decided to tell her. When I did, she just said, "Oh, that makes sense now." We wondered if that was what was going on. Apparently, my ghost liked to play pranks on her too, but she was accepting of it and said that in Mexico, it wasn't a big deal like it is here in the USA. She still works for me 20 years later.